There is a particular kind of domestic theatre that played out in nearly every American bathroom in 1957, and it began not with colour, but with the careful, deliberate removal of the previous night's face. The ritual started at the cold zinc vanity table, where a woman would unscrew the white lid of a Pond's cold cream jar, that heavy, satisfying twist, and begin working the thick, faintly floral emulsion into her skin in slow, meditative circles. The room smelled of camphor and something almost medicinal, underlaid by the warm, stale sweetness of last night's Chantilly dusting powder, still caught in the fold of a housecoat collar. This was not casual. This was preparation. Because before any woman of standing in 1957 could even begin thinking about what shade of coral lipstick she would pair with her aquamarine day dress, she had first to construct the perfect blank canvas that would make the matching possible at all. The cold cream ritual was the invisible architecture beneath every coordinated appearance. Pond's had understood this since the late 19th century, when its founder Theron Pond marketed his witch hazel extract as a tonic for the genteel complexion. By the early years of the 20th century, the company had reformulated into the thick, emollient cold cream that would become one of the best-selling beauty products in American history, a product so deeply embedded in the domestic rituals of American womanhood that its white jar became a kind of cultural shorthand for the entire category of nighttime skin maintenance. By 1957, Pond's was printing full-page advertisements in Ladies' Home Journal and Good Housekeeping that depicted dewy, flawlessly complexioned socialites attributing their luminous skin directly to faithful nightly cold cream use. These were not generic beauty promises. The copy was specific and persuasive. 2-step cold cream cleansing, first to dissolve and lift the day's cosmetics, second to restore and fortify the skin's natural moisture barrier. Women read this and believed it because the evidence of those who did not cleanse properly was visible everywhere. In the sallow, congested complexions of women who'd been lazy with their nighttime rituals and who now, in their early 30s, wore the consequence openly on their faces. Woodbury's facial soap competed vigorously with the cold, cream school of thought, arguing that a properly pH-balanced soap provided all the deep cleansing a woman's skin required. Their advertisements leaned harder on the language of science, featuring close-up illustrations of skin cells and pore diagrams that gave their pitch the glossy authority of a dermatologist's consultation. The Woodbury campaign of the early 1950s borrowed so heavily from medical visual language that many readers genuinely could not distinguish its graphic design from the illustrations in a pharmaceutical reference. This was entirely intentional. The cosmetics industry of the post-war period had discovered that the language and imagery of scientific authority, the white coat, the diagram, the clinical graph, transferred credibility onto product claims that would otherwise have required the consumer's faith alone. Woodbury's soap advertisements told women that their skin had a natural acid mantle that could be disrupted by harsh cleansers and restored by properly formulated gentle soap. And though this was more or less true in its outlines, the specific product implications were considerably more promotional than scientific. By the mid-1950s, women were navigating between these two competing schools of skin philosophy, the lush, emollient school championed by Pond's, and the brisk, clarifying school advanced by Woodbury and its rivals at Noxzema. Most women hedged, keeping both a cream jar and a soap cake at the vanity, depending on the season and the state of their complexion. Noxzema occupied an interesting middle territory between these two camps. It was a cream, technically, but it had a distinctly medicinal character, its sharp menthol scent and cooling tingle suggesting clinical effectiveness rather than luxurious pampering. A woman who used Noxzema was communicating something slightly different about her relationship to skincare than a woman who used Pond's, less interested in the ritual pleasure of the heavy cream, and more focused on a brisk, functional cleansing that would leave the skin clean and ready rather than coddled and emollient. These distinctions mattered, and the women who maintained them were paying close attention to a cosmetic marketplace that rewarded close attention. But here is where the idea of the matched face truly begins. Because the cold cream ritual of 1957 was not a uniform, one-size-fits-all procedure. It was calibrated. Women who planned to wear a pale matte foundation the following morning knew to apply their Pond's more liberally on nights before formal occasions, giving the skin an extra 24 hours of deep hydration so that the foundation would sit flat and poreless against the surface without gathering in fine lines. Women who intended to wear their dewy, sheer look, the kind suited to a light-sprigged cotton day dress, would use the cold cream more briskly, finishing with a cooler water rinse to close the pores and impart a faint, healthy tightness. This was the calibration not of vanity but of craft, the same kind of material awareness that a painter brings to understanding how the ground of a canvas will accept different paint formulations, or a dressmaker brings to understanding how different interfacings will behave with different weave weights. The matching instinct in 1957 extended backward in time, past the moment of application, into the preparation of the skin itself. A woman who had a luncheon on Tuesday and planned to wear her oyster-white shantung suit would begin thinking about her skin's readiness on Sunday evening. She might apply a slightly richer cold cream that night, follow it Monday morning with a careful toning with witch hazel, and avoid any foundation entirely on Monday if she could manage it, giving her complexion a rest day before the performance. Tuesday morning the skin would be at its best, rested, hydrated, receptive to the foundation she would apply in light, smooth strokes with a damp natural sea sponge, building coverage gently from the centre of the face outward. This temporal dimension of the matching practice, the way it reached backward through time to prepare for a future moment of coordinated appearance, is entirely absent from contemporary beauty culture, which is oriented almost entirely toward the immediate present, the single occasion, the single application. The brands that understood this deep calendar logic, the way women planned their skin backward from an event, thrived. Pond's began releasing seasonal cold cream formulations by the early 1950s, a lighter-weight summer version in a seafoam-tinted jar, and a richer, more occlusive winter formula in the classic white. This was not mere marketing innovation. It was an acknowledgement that the matched face was a seasonal project as much as a daily one, and that the women doing this work were sophisticated enough to understand the difference between a complexion suited to August linen and one built for November wool crepe. The summer cream was lighter, not because Pond's had reduced its efficacy, but because the summer complexion required less heavy occlusion. The warm weather kept the skin's own oil production relatively active, and a lighter cream maintained the balance without tipping the skin toward the congested, heavy appearance that summer heat could produce under a too-rich cream application. Elizabeth Arden entered the nighttime preparation market with her 8-hour cream, a product so versatile in its applications and so intensely petroleum-based in its formulation that it occupied an almost mythological status in the beauty cases of women who could afford it. The 8-hour cream was not a cold cream in the Pond's tradition. It was more occlusive, more intensive, less easily removed in the morning, and therefore best suited to targeted application rather than full-face spreading. Women used it on dry elbows and cuticles and the occasional chapped patch above the brow, and the beauty pages of Harper's Bazaar had been recommending it for precisely these spot correction uses since its introduction in the early 40s. By 1957, the 8-hour cream had accumulated enough legend to be considered a beauty secret rather than merely a product, something that the best complexioned women knew about and used discreetly, a piece of insider knowledge passed from aunt to niece at vanity tables in well-appointed rooms. Helena Rubinstein, who understood the cosmetics business with the ferocious commercial intelligence that characterized her entire extraordinary career, had developed a line of complexion creams stratified by skin type with an organizational precision that anticipated the modern dermatological approach by several decades. Her creams were sold in a consultation framework. A saleswoman at the Rubinstein counter would assess the customer's skin type before recommending a specific cream formulation, and this assessment process created a relationship between the customer and the brand that was not purely transactional. Women who had been typed and assigned a Rubinstein cream felt that they had received personalized professional guidance, and they returned to the counter for subsequent purchases with a loyalty that Pond's mass-market approach could not quite replicate, however superior its market penetration. The Rubinstein experience was the matched face philosophy applied to the retail cosmetics transaction itself, the product matched to the person, rather than the person matched to the product. What the women of 1957 understood about their skin, and what has been partially lost in the subsequent 7 decades of accelerating beauty innovation, was that the blank canvas had to be maintained as well as prepared, that the matched face was not a one-day achievement, but a continuous ongoing practice, as much about the 72 hours before an appearance as about the 40 minutes of application that immediately preceded it. Today we talk about skin cycling and barrier repair and microbiome maintenance as though they were invented by dermatology podcasts, but the women of 1957 were already performing all of these operations every night at their cold zinc vanity tables, under the warm light of a single bulb smelling of ponds and quiet intention. The technology has changed almost beyond recognition. The underlying logic that a composed face requires composed skin, and that composed skin is earned through consistent, thoughtful daily practice, has not changed at all. The question of which foundation to select, and which to pair with which complexion preparation, was itself a subject of considerable complexity in 1957, and the cold cream ritual was inseparable from this decision because the choice of cold cream preparation directly determined which foundation formula would perform best. Pancake makeup, which Max Factor had developed for Technicolor film production, and which had crossed over into civilian use with enormous commercial success during the 1940s, required a differently prepared skin than the newer liquid foundations that were gaining market share by the mid-50s. Pancake was a pressed powder cream hybrid applied with a damp sponge, and it performed best on a skin surface that was neither too oily nor too dry, a balance that the cold cream preparation had to achieve rather than merely suggest. Women who overused the cold cream before a pancake application found that the cream's residual oils created a separation between the makeup and the skin that caused the pancake to slide and pool in a way that its advertising photographs had carefully not depicted. Hazel Bishop's long-lasting lipstick formula, the product that had made her a household name in the early 1950s, with its promise of a lip colour that would not kiss off or smear or migrate into the fine lines around the mouth, also depended on a specifically prepared skin surface for its best performance. Bishop had formulated her lipstick to bond with lip tissue rather than merely coating it, and the primer beneath, a light application of the same cold cream wiped almost entirely away, leaving only the faintest emollient residue on the lips, determined how well the bonding mechanism worked. Women who had tried and abandoned Hazel Bishop's formula after finding it caked or dried on their lips often discovered, after reading the beauty column advice of the period, that they had been applying it to lips that were too dry or too damp, and that the cold cream preparatory step was not optional. It was the key to the formulation's function, and without it, the most innovative lipstick of the decade performed no better than its cheaper competitors. The ritual's true sophistication lay in what it quietly insisted about the relationship between preparation and presentation, that the face one showed the world was not a thing produced in 40 minutes on a Tuesday morning, but the cumulative result of a consistent daily practice that had been building its effects across weeks and months and years. A woman who had maintained a faithful cold cream regimen for 5 years had a skin surface fundamentally different from a woman who had neglected it, and this difference was visible to any observant eye in the way the foundation sat on the skin, in the fineness of the pores, in the even luminosity of the complexion, at the end of a long day when lesser prepared skins were showing the effects of their workday. The matched face was, at its deepest level, a long-term project, a compound investment whose returns accumulated slowly and could not be hurried, and whose ultimate beneficiary was not the woman who had worn the face on a single occasion, but the woman who had maintained the practice faithfully enough that the face became, in some essential sense, simply her own. When Grace Kelly appeared on the cover of Life magazine in the spring of 1955, wearing a pale grey silk sheath and a complexion so evenly translucent that it seemed to emit its own soft light, she did not simply represent an ideal of beauty. She issued a structural challenge to every woman in America who cared about the relationship between her wardrobe and her face. The specific genius of the Grace Kelly look, and it was a look assembled with the same deliberate engineering that one might bring to a bridge or a clock, was that every element existed in deliberate tonal relationship with every other element. Her ash-blonde hair echoed the cool silver of her dress. Her foundation was cool-toned, a slightly rosy beige that did not compete with the fabric, but instead created a harmonious fourth wall between her face and the rest of the visual composition. Her lips were coral rose, not quite pink, not quite red, precisely calibrated to introduce a single warm note into an otherwise entirely cool palette without disrupting it. This was matching as a philosophy, as a discipline, as a kind of silent argument about what feminine refinement meant in the middle decade of the 20th century. The Hollywood studio system had been thinking about this problem since the 1920s, when the transition from black and white cinematography to early Technicolor forced makeup artists and wardrobe departments into an unprecedented creative dialogue. What worked beautifully on black and white film, the heavy theatrical pancake of the silent era, the sharp, cold eyes of early talkies, translated disastrously to early colour, which rendered reds as a violent, pulsing orange, and threw warm-toned skin into a sallow wash that no actress could survive commercially. MGM's makeup department, led by the legendary William Tuttle, began developing a colour correction philosophy that matched an actress's foundation and lip colour specifically to her assigned Technicolor palette for each picture. This was not simply a matter of taste, it was a technical requirement. The cameras demanded it, and the studios that ignored this requirement produced colour footage in which their leading women looked like unsuccessful amateur illustrations of themselves, rather than the cinematic ideals the box office required. The collaboration between the wardrobe and makeup departments at the major studios was extraordinarily detailed, and produced documentation that read more like architectural specifications than fashion notes. For each production, the colour stylist, a role that was distinct from both the costume designer and the makeup artist, would produce a colour board for each principal actress, mapping the palette of each major costume against the planned makeup for each scene. This board travelled to the makeup chair each morning and governed every application decision, from the foundation tone selected to the specific lip formula deployed. Actresses who had developed strong preferences about their own makeup, and most of the major stars had very definite views, learned to negotiate these preferences within the constraints of the colour board, accepting that the visual logic of the film superseded the logic of personal preference. By 1957, this studio logic had fully migrated into the civilian world, carried there by the enormous cultural authority of Hollywood magazines and the new medium of television. Photoplay and Modern Screen and Silver Screen, the fan publications that enjoyed circulations in the millions through the 1950s, ran regular features on the specific cosmetic choices of individual stars, detailing not merely the product names but the reasoning behind them. A feature on Grace Kelly might explain that her preference for cool-tone foundations was not accidental, but deliberate, chosen in explicit relationship to the silver and grey wardrobe that Edith Head had developed for her, and that her lipstick selection followed a colour temperature logic, rather than a simple preference for one shade over another. These features were enormously popular not because readers were interested in gossip, though gossip was certainly present in the same publications, but because they offered a legible system, a coherent explanatory framework for decisions that might otherwise have seemed arbitrary or inaccessible. Marilyn Monroe occupied the opposite pole of this matched-face conversation, and her opposition was deliberate and instructive. Where Grace Kelly refined and receded, where her face and outfit formed a conversation that never raised its voice, Monroe amplified and advanced. Her signature red lip was not chosen in relationship to what she was wearing. It was chosen in relationship to itself, to its own symbolic weight, to the long cultural history of the red mouth as a signal of appetite and availability and power. Monroe's face did not match her outfits. Her face competed with them, and she understood that this competition was precisely the point. Her foundation, applied thickly, almost photographically matte, was not calibrated to any specific palette. It was calibrated to the camera and the camera alone. Her lashes were heavy, their weight a deliberate engineering of visual attention toward the eyes at the expense of the surrounding face. The result was a different kind of matching entirely. Not a harmony of analogous tones, but an aggressive, deliberate contrast that made every element louder by proximity to every other element. William Tuttle at MGM and Ben Nye at 20th Century Fox, the two most influential studio makeup artists of the 1950s, had opposing views about the Monroe approach that their respective contractual relationships made it undiplomatic to express publicly, but that found their way into the trade press in oblique and suggestive ways. The prevailing professional consensus in the makeup community was that the Monroe signature was a performance strategy rather than a beauty ideal, a system calibrated for a specific performer in a specific context that would produce unconvincing or even grotesque results when transposed onto a face that did not share Monroe's particular combination of screen presence and physical characteristics. The civilian woman who attempted the Monroe approach without Monroe's features was considered to have made a miscalculation of the same order as an amateur painter attempting to reproduce a Sargent portrait by purchasing the same pigments without the same technical mastery. The tools were available. The technique was the thing. American women of 1957 were not choosing between these two women as though choosing between two dresses on a rack. They were choosing between two entire cosmetic philosophies, two different theories about what the face was for and what relationship it should have to the body and the clothing it inhabited. The department store cosmetics counter understood this implicitly. Elizabeth Arden counters were decorated in pale pink and ivory, and built a world for the woman who identified with the Kelly school, soft, harmonized, coolly authoritative. Revlon's counters blazed with lacquered red and gold, and the women who gravitated toward them were making a different declaration entirely. The beauty industry had, with extraordinary commercial intuition, divided itself along exactly the lines that Hollywood had drawn, and the women shopping those counters on a Saturday afternoon in 1957 were not merely buying lipstick. They were casting a vote for a specific theory of selfhood. Audrey Hepburn introduced a third archetype into this already complex conversation in the early 1950s, and by 1957 she had achieved an influence on the matching aesthetic that was arguably greater than either Kelly or Monroe because her approach was more widely adoptable by the ordinary woman. Where Kelly required a particular coolness of colouring, and Monroe required a particular boldness of personality, Hepburn's look was organised around the eyes, specifically the extraordinary graphic power of the heavy extended brow and the clean, precise eyeline. And this eye-centric approach was translatable across a much wider range of physical types. The Hepburn woman was not trying to achieve either Kelly's tonal refinement or Monroe's aggressive amplification. She was creating a face that read as modern, graphic, slightly architectural, and in which the eye was both the subject and the frame. Her clothing choices, the slim pants, the ballet flats, the oversized sunglasses, formed a matching system with this graphic face that was entirely coherent and entirely original, a matching philosophy that owed nothing to the studio tradition, and everything to the European modernist design sensibility that Hepburn herself embodied with such natural authority. By 1957, these three archetypes, the Kelly refinement, the Monroe amplification, and the Hepburn graphic, had been thoroughly absorbed into the vocabulary of the beauty press, which used them as reference points the way an art teacher uses historical periods, not as templates to be literally copied, but as coordinates on a conceptual map that helped a woman locate her own preferred aesthetic position. A woman might say she was more Kelly than Monroe, the way she might say she preferred Impressionism to Baroque, and in both cases what she was really communicating was a set of values about the relationship between surface and content, between decoration and structure, between the visible and the suggested. The matched face of 1957 was not simply a cosmetic project. It was a philosophical position expressed in foundation and lipstick and eyeline, and the archetypes that Hollywood provided gave ordinary women the language in which to conduct that expression. The practical mechanics of the studio-to-street transfer of the matched face philosophy required a commercial infrastructure that did not yet exist in the early 1950s, and had to be built largely from scratch by a cosmetics industry that saw the opportunity clearly, but had to construct the means to exploit it. The department store cosmetics counter, which had existed since the turn of the century, had to be reorganized from a counter at which individual products were sold to a counter at which complete looks, complete matched systems, were demonstrated and sold as ensembles. This reorganization was driven partly by the commercial logic of selling more products per customer interaction, and partly by the genuine consumer demand for a coherent system, rather than a collection of individual items. Elizabeth Arden was perhaps the most architecturally consistent of the major beauty houses in this regard. Her Red Door salons, which operated in major American cities and provided both treatment services and cosmetics retail, had been organized around the concept of the complete beauty consultation since their founding in the early 20th century, and by the 1950s this organizational principle had been refined into a very specific retail experience in which a trained consultant would assess a customer's skin type, complexion tone, and lifestyle requirements before making coordinated product recommendations. The customer left not with a single lipstick or a single foundation, but with a complete palette, a coordinated set of products whose colours and formulas had been selected to work together and to work with the specific characteristics of that customer's face. This was the matched face as retail philosophy, and its commercial success was substantial enough that other houses were forced to develop their own versions of the consultation approach. The women's magazines functioned as a secondary educational system in the dissemination of the matched face philosophy, and their influence was considerably broader than that of the department store counter. They reached women in small towns and rural areas who had no access to Elizabeth Arden consultants or Helena Rubinstein counters, and they brought the vocabulary and the logic of the matched face into households where it might not otherwise have penetrated. Vogue and Harper's Bazaar set the aesthetic standard and operated at the aspirational end of the magazine spectrum, but it was the middle market magazines, McCall's, Ladies' Home Journal, Good Housekeeping, Woman's Day, that translated the matching philosophy into practical, reproducible guidance for the ordinary American woman who was shopping at her local drugstore rather than at a department store cosmetics counter. These magazines ran monthly beauty columns that were, in effect, matching guides. How to select the right lipstick for the current season's popular fabric colours, how to update last season's eye makeup to coordinate with the new hemline silhouette, how to select a foundation tone that would work with the new warm palette that autumn fashion had established as its dominant register. The fashion illustration that accompanied beauty editorial in the 1950s women's magazines was itself a form of matched face instruction disguised as decoration. The illustrators who produced these images, René Gruot for the European fashion press, Joe Euler, and Kenneth Paul Block for the American magazines, worked in a style that simplified and clarified the relationship between the face and the clothing, precisely because the illustration format, unlike photography, allowed them to control every element of the visual composition. A Gruot illustration of a woman in a black evening dress would show a face whose lipstick was the single most saturated colour element in the image, creating a compositional relationship between face and dress that a photograph might have rendered differently depending on the lighting and the film sensitivity, and a dozen other technical variables. The illustration made the matching logic explicit by making it the only logic the image contained. In the spring of 1957, a woman could walk into the cosmetics department at Macy's on Herald Square in New York City and find, arranged in a glass case along the left wall, no fewer than 14 distinct liquid eyeliners from 6 different manufacturers. Each one promised precision. Each one claimed to deliver the clean, unbroken arc of the professional makeup artist. Each one, and this was the extraordinary thing, the thing that is so easy to overlook from this distance, was formulated with a slightly different colour undertone, ranging from the deep true black of Maybelline's liquid liner through the soft brownish black of Max Factor's Eye Lure to the charcoal grey cast of Helena Rubinstein's Mascara-Matic liner wand. These were not cosmetic accidents. These were engineering decisions, made with full understanding that a woman selecting a liquid liner in 1957 was not selecting an isolated product. She was selecting the element that would define the geometry of her gaze in deliberate relationship to what she had already decided to wear. The history of the liquid eyeliner reaches back considerably further than the 1950s. Ancient Egyptian cosmetic practice, the kohl-lined eye that stares back at us from sarcophagi and papyrus paintings across thousands of years of human civilization, was the earliest and most enduring expression of the cultural instinct to define the eye's perimeter with a line. The Egyptians understood something that 1957 women understood too, that the eye is the face's primary instrument of communication, the element toward which the human gaze is drawn before any other, and that the act of defining its edge is the act of controlling the first impression one makes on another person. The line is not decoration. The line is power, channeled and directed through the specific geometry of its execution. The 1950s do-eye had a specific structural logic. The line began at the inner corner of the upper lid, thin as a hairline, and expanded gradually as it travelled outward, reaching its maximum weight just past the outer edge of the iris, before lifting into the signature upward flick at the outer corner. This flick was not decorative whimsy. It was a calculated optical correction designed to counteract the natural downward pull of the outer corners of most women's eyes, and to open the eye into the wide, slightly startled expression that the era associated with feminine freshness and youth. Getting the flick wrong was not a minor mistake. A flick angled too sharply upward created the impression of aggression, suggesting a sharpness of temperament that was considered out of register with the harmonious, composed persona the 1957 beauty ideal required. A flick that drooped even fractionally downward defeated the entire purpose of the exercise and made the wearer look tired rather than alert, heavy rather than bright, which was the cosmetic equivalent of arriving to a formal occasion in house slippers. Women practiced this line obsessively, and the beauty literature of the period documented their practice with the same earnest technical detail that a sports magazine might apply to the golf swing or the tennis serve. Beauty manuals described the technique in language that would not have been out of place in a drafting manual. Hold the brush at a specific angle relative to the lid surface, somewhere between 30 and 45 degrees depending on the roundness of the individual eye. Rest the elbow on the vanity table to stabilize the application hand, and eliminate the micro-tremor that was the primary enemy of a clean line. Pull the outer corner of the eye gently taut with the opposite hand's ring finger. The ring finger, specifically, because it exerts less involuntary pressure than the index finger, and is less likely to distort the lid in a way that misplaces the resulting line. Execute the entire length of the line in a single, fluid, confident stroke, rather than building it up from multiple short overlapping marks which created a jagged edge that no amount of subsequent blotting could fully repair. The liner had to be applied before mascara, before shadow, before everything else that would follow, because the geometry of the liner defined the parameters within which all other eye elements would be placed. Revlon had entered the liquid liner market in the early 1950s with a product called Precision Eyeliner that came in a narrow bottle with a glass applicator wand, an advance over the flat brush applicators that had dominated the category up to that point, because the wand allowed a more controlled deposit of product and produced a finer initial line. The bottle design was elegant enough to sit on a vanity without embarrassment, which was a commercial consideration as important as the formula itself, because women of 1957 evaluated every object that occupied space on their vanity tables, partly on its visual contribution to that space. A beautiful bottle was not merely pleasant, it was a statement about the owner's standards and the seriousness with which she approached the beauty ritual. Revlon understood this and packaged accordingly. But here is where the matching imperative arrives with full force. The colour of the liner was chosen not simply in relation to the natural colour of the wearer's eyes, but in explicit relationship to the colour of the outfit. A woman wearing a slate blue wool suit would choose a liner with a slightly cooler, greyer cast. Revlon offered one called Midnight Blue that served this function perfectly, its slight blue cast resonating with the cool tones of the fabric without precisely matching them. A woman in a warm brown tweed would select a softer, earthier black, something with a brownish undertone that brought the eyes into sympathetic relationship with the warm notes in the fabric. A woman in a particularly vivid jewel-toned outfit, the emerald silk blouse, the sapphire wool dress, might choose a liner that amplified rather than harmonized, selecting a deep teal or navy that introduced a visual echo of the outfit's color intensity directly into the eye, making the gaze itself a continuation of the outfit's color argument. Helena Rubinstein had popularized the concept of the color-matched eye ensemble in the early 1950s, selling liner, mascara, and shadow in coordinated color families that a woman could select by outfit grouping rather than by individual product. This was a marketing revolution dressed in the language of elegance, and it worked because it gave women a system, a rational, organized framework for a decision that could otherwise feel arbitrary and overwhelming. The Rubinstein eye fashion concept, which was heavily promoted through the women's press and through department store displays that grouped the coordinated products on wooden palette boards arranged by color family, turned the eye makeup decision from an individual judgment call into a structured selection process that was simultaneously easier to execute and more visually coherent in its results. Max Factor's Pan Stick Foundation, released in the late 1940s and enormously popular throughout the 1950s among both professional makeup artists and civilian consumers, came with a colour-matching chart that cross-referenced complexion tones with eye colour families and recommended specific liner and shadow pairings for each combination. This was, in essence, the first algorithmically structured beauty matching system available to the mass consumer, a printed decision tree that walked a woman from her foundation number to her liner colour to her shadow shade in a series of logical steps. Women kept these charts tucked inside their vanity mirror frames or pressed between the pages of their beauty books. They consulted them the way a chef consults a recipe, not because they lacked instinct or taste, but because the matching system was complex enough and the social stakes of getting it wrong were visible enough that having a reliable reference felt like practical wisdom rather than dependency. The mascara that finished the liner's work deserves its own examination here because it was the element that transformed the geometry of the liner from an abstraction into a dramatic statement. Maybelline's mascara, sold in the familiar pink and green rectangular compact with the small brush that had to be wetted before application, dominated the mass market through the 1950s, with a formula that had changed remarkably little from the company's founding product of the 19-teens. The cake mascara required a ritual of its own, wetting the small brush, working it into the cake to build up a charge of product, applying the product to the upper lashes in upward strokes from root to tip, allowing the first coat to dry before applying a second, and combing the lashes afterward with a small, fine-toothed lash comb to separate any clumping and restore individual lash definition. This process took time, and the women who did it well, who produced the clean, separated, dramatically curved lashes that the period's beauty ideal required, had developed through practice a proprioceptive understanding of brush pressure and product saturation that made their results consistent in a way that mere instruction could not guarantee. The modern eye look industry, the vast churning ecosystem of palettes and primers and setting sprays and graphic liners, owes its entire vocabulary to the liquid liner geometry of 1957. The cat eye has never left the cultural imagination. Not really. It reappears every decade, slightly modified, slightly tilted, pulled further or held closer to the original geometry, but always returning to the same essential logic, that a clean, upward lifted line at the outer corner of the eye creates an expression of alertness and authority that no other cosmetic technique fully replicates. The women who spent 20 minutes at their vanity mirrors in 1957, elbow steadied on the cold surface, ring finger pulling the corner taut, were not performing an ancient ritual in any passive or unconscious sense. They were making a decision, every single morning, about the specific quality of attention they wanted their eyes to project into the world, and then executing that decision with a technical precision that any graphic designer would recognize as serious craft. The shadow that accompanied the liner in the complete eye composition of 1957 deserves its own consideration as a matching element. Eyeshadow in the mid-decade was not the expansive, highly pigmented, dramatically saturated medium that it would become in subsequent decades. The conventional palette available at a Macy's cosmetics counter in 1957 was organized around a narrow range of muted, naturalistic tones. The pale mauve, the soft sage, the dusty blue-grey, the warm taupe, applied with a small flat brush in a single colour wash from the lash line to the crease, with a slightly lighter shade optional on the brow bone. The effect was meant to suggest natural shadow, the depth that the eye socket already contained, enhanced rather than altered by the cosmetic addition. A woman who applied a vivid, saturated shadow colour in 1957 was making a statement about her willingness to be conspicuous that most social contexts of the period did not support, and the beauty press was consistent in counselling restraint. Shadow should deepen, not announce. It should direct the eye toward the liner and the lash, rather than competing with them for attention. The relationship between the shadow colour and the outfit was governed by the same tonal logic that governed the liner selection. A woman in a burgundy wool dress might select a rose taupe shadow that picked up the warm pink undertone of the fabric, without directly imitating its deep red-purple saturation. The shadow's function was harmonic resonance, not quotation. A woman in a forest green tweed might use a slightly olive-cast grey shadow that acknowledged the fabric's cool darkness without attempting to replicate its colour. The key principle was that the eye makeup as a system, liner, shadow, mascara together, should create a visual that was in conversation with the outfit's palette, while remaining independently legible as an eye, as a feature, as the thing to which the face directed its attention. The matched face was not a face that disappeared into its clothing. It was a face that met its clothing as an equal, each element recognizing and honoring the other. The mascara wand of the period was undergoing a quiet technical revolution that would not fully manifest commercially until the early 1960s, but whose precursors were already visible on the shelves in 1957. The traditional cake mascara, applied with a flat brush that the user wetted with saliva or water, was beginning to face competition from tube mascaras that contained a cream formula dispensed through a wand applicator, a design that would eventually replace the cake format almost entirely. Helena Rubinstein's Mascara-Matic had introduced this format in the early 50s and had demonstrated its practical advantages. The wand applicator was more consistent in its product deposit, less susceptible to the variations in brush saturation that made cake mascara application unpredictable, and sufficiently sealed in its tube to resist the drying and contamination that plagued the cake format, when its applicator was not cleaned regularly. Women who tried the wand format and found it easier to use did not return to the cake, and the gradual shift in market share through the late 50s reflected this technical evolution working its way quietly through consumer preference. In 1957, a woman purchasing a butterick sewing pattern for a new wool sheath dress received, tucked inside the pattern envelope along with the tissue paper pieces, a small folded card that listed the standard measurements for the size she had selected. These measurements were not gentle suggestions. They were specifications, as precise and unforgiving as the seam allowances printed on the tissue paper itself. The standard 1957 size 12 assumed a 32-inch bust, a 24-inch waist and a 34-inch hip. These were numbers that haunted American women with a quiet, persistent ferocity, because the fashions of the mid-century decade, the nipped waist, the full skirt, the slim sheath, were built on a proportional ideal that the human body, in its ordinary unmanaged state, frequently declined to provide. The dress required a specific body, and the body that the dress required was narrower through the middle than most adult women managed to be without significant and sustained effort. The response to this structural tension was an entire industry of reducing, as the era politely called it. The word diet was considered slightly vulgar in polite 1957 company. One reduced, or watched one's figure, or followed a health regimen. The actual regimens in question range from the medically plausible to the genuinely peculiar, and the beauty press of the period navigated between them with a cheerful impartiality that modern readers find either charming or alarming depending on their temperament. What linked all these approaches, the genuinely useful and the thoroughly useless alike, was the same matching philosophy that governed every other aspect of the 1957 woman's composed appearance. The body was a surface that required maintenance and calibration, and the goal of that maintenance was to produce a body that matched the decade's silhouette with as little corrective architecture as possible. Knox gelatin, which had been marketed since the early 20th century as a health supplement and fingernail strengthener, found a second life in the 1950s as a weight management tool. Women were advised by beauty columns in women's magazines to dissolve a packet of plain Knox in a glass of cold water and drink it each morning before breakfast. The theory was that the gelatin coated the stomach and reduced appetite. It almost certainly did not in any significant physiological sense, but the ritual provided the psychological comfort of purposeful action, and purposeful action was what the reducing culture demanded. The Knox Company, which was selling an enormous quantity of its product to women who had no intention of making aspic salads, supported this usage through carefully worded endorsements that stopped just short of explicit weight loss claims, offering instead the vocabulary of health and vitality that regulatory bodies of the period had not yet fully constrained. The tomato juice fast appeared in beauty columns throughout the mid-50s as a short-term measure for rapid figure correction before a major social event. The protocol varied somewhat between sources but typically involved consuming only tomato juice, sometimes with the addition of a raw egg yolk for protein, for between 3 and 5 days immediately preceding the occasion. Women reported losing between 3 and 5 pounds on this regime, a result that reflected fluid loss more than any reduction in adipose tissue, and the pounds returned reliably within days of resuming normal eating. But the short-term result, the slightly flatter abdomen, the face that read as slightly more angular in the mirror on the morning of the occasion, was real enough to sustain the practice through repeated cycles of anticipation, restriction, and recovery. The grapefruit diet, which required the consumption of half a grapefruit before each meal, was claimed to work through the enzymatic action of a compound in the fruit that broke down dietary fat and promoted its elimination from the body. No such compound exists, as any biochemist would have confirmed, but the grapefruit was a legitimate low-calorie food that added bulk to the beginning of each meal, and thereby genuinely did reduce subsequent intake to some modest degree. The Hollywood 18-day diet, which was attributed to the MGM Studio Nutrition Department, with a specificity of provenance that was wholly fabricated, organized this grapefruit principle into a detailed 1,400-calorie daily menu that was reprinted in beauty columns and women's magazines throughout the 1950s with the faithful regularity of a proven authority. That it had no actual connection to Hollywood or to MGM or to any nutritional professional whatsoever did nothing to diminish its authority, because the invocation of Hollywood was, in the cosmetic culture of 1957, a form of credential that ordinary women found more convincing than any scientific citation. Sylvia of Hollywood, the reducing salon operator who had managed the figures of MGM contract actresses, published a best-selling book in the early 1950s that advised a combination of massage, careful eating, and specific exercises organized around the particular problem areas that the 1957 silhouette most mercilessly exposed. The massage component was crucial in Sylvia's system because the reducing philosophy of the 1950s held that fat was not merely an excess to be burned away through caloric restriction, but a physical substance that could be manipulated, kneaded and rolled and pounded out of the body with the right technique and sufficient dedication. Reducing salons operated in major cities and prosperous suburbs offering exactly this service. A woman would lie on a padded table while an attendant worked her thighs and hips and abdomen with practiced business-like efficiency, using techniques borrowed from both athletic massage and hydrotherapy that had been adapted for the specific vocabulary of cosmetic reducing. These establishments smelled of talcum powder and rubber and something vaguely herbal, and they offered a peculiar combination of clinical authority and spa luxury that made them enormously attractive to women who wanted their reducing to feel active and supervised rather than private and undirected. The salon experience provided something that the home gelatin drink or the grapefruit breakfast could not: witness, accountability, and the reassuring sense that a professional had examined the problem and found it solvable. Women who visited reducing salons regularly, and some visited weekly, maintaining appointments as faithfully as their hairdressing visits, spoke about the attendants in terms that combined the vocabulary of the therapeutic relationship with the vocabulary of the domestic service relationship, a hybrid that reflected the ambiguous professional status of the salon worker and the complex emotional investment of the client. Metrical, the first commercially successful meal replacement drink, launched in 1960 and transformed the reducing conversation permanently. But in 1957 its territory was occupied by a variety of appetite-suppressant candies and pills that operated largely on the stimulant principle, suppressing hunger through a caffeine-adjacent chemical effect that also produced the mildly elevated heart rate and slightly heightened sense of alertness that their users found useful for managing the fatigue of caloric restriction. AIDS-reducing candy, which occupied a particularly odd cultural position, its name later made thoroughly unusable by historical tragedy, was sold through mail order and in drugstores, and had a loyal following among women who found that a small piece of the sweet, waxy candy before meals reduced the urgency of their appetite enough to make eating less feel voluntary rather than punishing. The deeper logic connecting all of this to the matched face is this. In 1957, the body was understood as a garment in its own right, and like the dresses and suits one wore over it, it required constant maintenance, adjustment, and coordination with the current season's silhouette. The nipped waist that Christian Dior had established as the defining feature of the post-war feminine silhouette required a specific body configuration that the decades reducing culture relentlessly pursued, and the relationship between that pursuit and the women conducting it was not experienced as oppression by most of those women, or at least not experienced only as oppression. It was also experienced as competence, as the satisfying exercise of the same disciplined attention they brought to every other element of their composed appearance. The body was a project, and projects, properly managed, had outcomes that could be planned and achieved. This was, in its way, an expression of post-war optimism, the conviction that careful work could produce intended results, that the gap between the woman one was and the woman the dress required could be closed through discipline and knowledge and the right products applied in the right sequence. The exercise prescription of the 1950s reducing culture was as specific and as carefully organized as its dietary component, though it was informed by a physiological understanding that was considerably less rigorous than its promoters implied. The Royal Canadian Air Force exercise plan, which circulated widely in the late 1950s in a thin booklet distributed through military and then civilian channels, provided a structured program of calisthenics organized into a progressive intensity ladder that women were expected to advance through over the course of several weeks. The exercises were described with a quasi-military precision, specific repetition counts, specific timing requirements, specific body positions to be maintained during each movement, and this structure, with its suggestion of a tested, proven, externally validated system, gave the program a credibility that more casually presented exercise advice lacked. Reducing clubs operated in church halls and community centres throughout the country, offering the social support and accountability structure that individual dieting could not provide. These organizations, which would eventually evolve into the formal commercial entity of Weight Watchers, founded by Jean Nidetch in 1963, met weekly and combined the weighing-in ritual, at which each member's progress was recorded and acknowledged by the group, with a discussion of the practical challenges of the reducing week and the sharing of strategies for managing the social occasions, the dinner parties, the cocktail hours, the church potluck suppers, that constituted the primary threat to any woman's reducing schedule. The social dimension of these clubs was as important as any specific dietary guidance they provided because the women who attended them consistently lost more weight and maintained their losses more durably than women who attempted the same dietary approaches in isolation, and this finding, essentially rediscovered every decade by research that seems to surprise its discoverers anew, was already practically understood by the housewives of 1957 who organised and attended these weekly meetings in the basements of their local churches. The wardrobe incentive was the silent engine of the reducing motivation, and it operated differently from any other motivational structure the era's advice culture acknowledged. A woman who had purchased a butterick sheath pattern in a size 12 and discovered that her current measurements required a size 14 was not merely disappointed in an abstract sense. She was committed to a specific physical goal that had a specific completion date, a specific observable metric, and a specific tangible reward available at the end of the process. The dress was not merely a destination, it was a promise she had made to herself about who she would be when she arrived there. The woman who wore the sheath, who sat down to dinner in the sheath without anxiety, who stood to greet guests and felt the fabric fall correctly from shoulder to hem, without pulling or straining or revealing through its resistance the gap between the body she had and the body she had planned on. This was the matched face applied to the body's fullest dimension, the aspiration not merely to look correct but to be, in the physical and kinesthetic sense, correctly calibrated to the specific demands of the life one intended to live. The women's magazine Diet column of 1957 operated in an interesting tension with the same magazine's food section, which in the same issue might feature recipes for the rich, butter-heavy casseroles and cream sauce-draped chicken dishes that constituted the period's aspirational home cooking. This tension was never directly acknowledged in the pages of the magazines, which treated their reducing content and their recipe content as addressing entirely separate aspects of the reader's life, rather than the somewhat contradictory aspects of the same life. A woman who read both columns in the same sitting, who absorbed both the lime gelatin dessert recipe and the advice to avoid sweets as reducing saboteurs, was expected to navigate between them using the same social intelligence she brought to the matching of her outfit, understanding that different contexts required different responses, and that the ability to move between them without confusion was itself a form of competence. On a Friday night in the autumn of 1957, somewhere in the suburban geography between Long Island and Los Angeles, approximately 30 million American women were doing precisely the same thing. They had washed their hair that morning, set it on metal clips or rubber-tipped pins during the afternoon, and were now sitting at their vanity tables in housecoats and chenille robes, carefully removing the clips in the sequence their beauty manual prescribed, and beginning the process of brushing and finger-waving the resulting coils into the smooth, bounced shape that Saturday morning demanded. The operation had taken the better part of the preceding 18 hours. This was not considered unusual. This was the standard chronological architecture of the post-war feminine beauty week, as regular and as seriously observed as the weekly grocery run and the Sunday dinner preparation, and women who attempted to shortcut it produced results that were legible to every other woman in their social world as shortcuts, and therefore as failures of the particular kind of failure that the 1950s found most difficult to excuse. The pin curl had a physics to it that women of the 1950s understood intuitively, with the kind of practical knowledge that accumulates through years of tactile experimentation rather than formal instruction. A curl wound tightly around a small diameter pin would produce a firmer, more defined wave, suitable for the precisely sculpted styles worn to formal occasions. A curl wound more loosely around a larger diameter roller produced a softer, more voluminous wave, better suited to the casual relaxed bounce that the shirtwaist dress required for daytime wear. The angle at which the hair was wound, flat against the scalp or rolled away from it at a slight diagonal, determined whether the resulting wave moved toward the face or away from it, and this directional decision was made in deliberate relationship to the specific hairstyle the woman was building toward and the occasion for which that hairstyle was intended. A wave that moved toward the face created an intimate, slightly soft visual effect, suited to social occasions that called for warmth and approachability. A wave that moved away from the face, set on rollers angled back and away from the hairline, created a more open, more architecturally assertive look suited to business contexts and formal events, where a composed, authoritative impression was the goal. The setting lotion was the chemical assistant that the mechanical pin curl required. Tony Wave Set, Alberto VO5 setting lotion, and Dippity Dough, that peculiar translucent green gel in the tub that appeared on the market in the early 1960s and immediately replaced half a decade of competing formulas through the sheer force of its superior hold, were the products that women applied to sections of damp hair before winding each curl, creating a chemical stiffening agent that dried as the curl sat and maintained the wave structure against the compressing and disturbing effects of sleep. The setting lotion had a smell. Most of them had a chemical quality that was not quite pleasant, but had become so familiar through use that women associated it not with harshness, but with the pleasant anticipation of the morning result. The smell meant the process was working. The smell was the olfactory equivalent of the contractor's dust, evidence of productive labour that would resolve into something beautiful when the work was complete. Tony Home Permanents had transformed this landscape in the late 1940s, when their cold wave kit made it possible for women to give themselves a permanent wave at home for a fraction of the price charged by professional salons. The Tony kit smelled memorably, a sharp, sulphurous chemical bite that lingered in bathrooms for days afterward, and permeated towels and washcloths with an odour that no amount of laundering fully eliminated. But it produced credible results if the instructions were followed precisely, and American women followed them in vast numbers throughout the 1950s. The company's advertising campaign, built around the famous question, "Which twin has the Tony?" positioned the Home Permanent as qualitatively indistinguishable from the salon version, a claim that was debatable in the hands of an inexperienced applicant, but credible enough in the hands of a woman who had administered the process a dozen times, and understood exactly how long to leave the waving solution on her specific hair type, and how thoroughly to neutralize it afterward to prevent the overcooking that turned a soft wave into a frizzy, damaged disaster. The hairnet completed the nighttime preparation apparatus and is perhaps the most thoroughly forgotten object in the entire 1957 beauty economy. Once the pin curls were set, the net went over them, a fine mesh hairnet in brown or black, or, for fair-haired women, the nearly invisible beige that beauty supply stores sold alongside the metal clips and the setting lotion and the bobby pins that constituted the complete pin curl kit. The net held the curls flat against the scalp through the night, and prevented the pillow from dislodging or compressing individual curls in ways that would create asymmetries in the morning wave. Women who slept without the net found that their careful curl map had been rearranged by sleep into something that required substantially more brush-out time to manage into shape, and some damage to the wave's structural integrity was inevitable. The net was a small inconvenience, slightly constricting against the scalp, slightly warm, slightly rustling against the pillow, but the hair that emerged from beneath it in the morning was demonstrably superior to the hair that had spent the night unprotected, and this demonstration, repeated every week for years, was all the argument most women needed. The morning brush-out was the moment of composition, the point at which the wave's raw material was shaped into the specific social persona the day required. The sequence was invariable. Remove the net, remove the clips in the order prescribed by the hairstyle's wave pattern, then begin brushing from the scalp outward and downward in long, smooth strokes that stretched the tight pin curl into a broad, soft wave. The bristle brush was important. A natural bristle brush, typically boar bristle, was considered essential for this operation because the natural bristles distributed the hair's natural oils from root to tip as they brushed, imparting the shine that synthetic bristles could not replicate. The brushing itself required a particular technique. The hand holding the brush moved in a long arc from the crown of the head downward and outward, while the other hand followed the brush on the opposite side of the section being brushed, guiding the hair into the desired direction and maintaining the tension that kept the wave smooth rather than frizzy. Here the matching imperative becomes vivid and specific. A Saturday morning might require the housewife's practical softness, a loose wave, barely structured, easily covered by a headscarf for grocery shopping, and then shaken out for an afternoon visit. This required the lightest brush out, just enough to separate the curls into waves without extending them into the full, formal bounce of the evening style. Sunday required the church hat silhouette, meaning the hair had to be dressed close and smooth at the crown to accept the hat's brim at the correct angle, without creating a lumpy, uncomfortable interface between hat and hair, a requirement that called for a more thorough brushing and the application of a light lacquer spray to keep the crown smooth through the ceremony. A Tuesday luncheon in the city required something more architecturally definite, a smooth chignon or a carefully placed wave that would hold through cocktails and not require touching up in the powder room, which meant the stiffest possible setting lotion concentration the night before, and a brushing out technique that sacrificed some of the wave's natural movement in exchange for structural durability. Breck shampoo, which spent lavishly on full-colour magazine advertising throughout the 1950s, built its brand identity entirely around the image of healthy, lustrous, well-managed hair. The Breck girl, the idealistically rendered portrait that appeared on those advertisements across 2 decades, executed with a painterly softness that occupied the territory between photography and illustration, had hair that existed in a state of perpetual effortless perfection. Of course, there was nothing effortless about it. The Breck girl's hair was the consequence of exactly the same Friday night pin curl discipline, the same Tony chemical scaffolding, the same morning brush-out ritual that 30 million women were performing that same Friday night. The advertisement's genius was precisely its omission of this labour, its suggestion that the right shampoo, rather than the right 18-hour preparation sequence, produced the result. Women knew this was not entirely true, but the dream of effortlessness was so appealing, and the Breck imagery so beautiful in its depiction of what that effortlessness might look like, that they bought the shampoo anyway and then went home to set their pin curls. The Saturday afternoon salon visit was the professional counterpart to the home pin curl ritual, and the two existed in a relationship that most women understood as complementary rather than competing. The salon visit, typically a weekly or bi-weekly appointment that lasted between 1 and 2 hours depending on the service, provided the professional cut and shaping that determined the pin curl structure, and the home ritual maintained the professional result between visits in a state of acceptable presentation. A woman who skipped her salon appointment for 2 or 3 consecutive weeks found that the pin curl's results gradually deteriorated, not because her technique had changed, but because the haircut's underlying shape was losing definition, and no amount of home setting could fully compensate for the structural clarity that a professional trim provided. The salon itself was a social institution of considerable importance in the lives of the women who used it, a point that contemporary accounts tend to romanticize slightly, but that contemporary women's own accounts confirm was genuinely true. The permanent wave appointment, which required the client to sit with her head covered in rubber-tipped rods, and the sharp-smelling waving solution for an hour or more, created conditions of enforced physical proximity and conversational intimacy that few other settings duplicated. The woman in the next chair was a stranger, or an acquaintance, or a neighbour, and the conversation that developed between them in the hours of shared chemical patience had a distinctive quality, more open than social small talk, less guarded than the conversation of close friends who maintained the careful self-monitoring that long familiarity sometimes imposed. The hairdresser herself occupied a peculiar role in this social economy, functioning simultaneously as skilled technician, trusted confidant, and social intelligence source who had, by virtue of her position at the centre of the neighbourhood's female beauty circuit, an extraordinarily comprehensive picture of the social landscape surrounding her. Bobby pins and wave clips were not interchangeable in the 1957 cosmetics economy, and the distinction between them was understood by any woman who had spent more than a few weeks with a serious pin curl practice. The bobby pin, the doubled-strand wire pin with a slightly ridged inner surface that held hair through friction, was used for securing pin curls at the scalp and for maintaining the wave pattern during sleep. The wave clip, a spring-loaded metal clip with a flat, wide-grip surface, was used for setting the wave at the crown and sides during the setting and drying phase, where its wider grip created a broader, smoother wave indentation than the rounded contour of the bobby pin could produce. A woman who confused these applications found that her bobby-pinned crown had a series of small, sharp creases, rather than the smooth, broad wave that the wave clips produced, and that her wave-clipped curl bases had slipped loose during sleep because the clip's spring mechanism, without the friction surface of the bobby pin's ridged inner wire, could not maintain its grip against the movement of sleep. The right tool in the right place was as important in the pin curl kit as it was at the vanity table or the kitchen counter. Precision in small things was the habit of mind that produced the matched face and the perfectly set hair, and it was not a habit that could be selectively applied. The bobby pin economy of the 1950s was enormous, and its scale is difficult to convey to a contemporary reader who has not personally maintained a pin curl practice across years. A woman with a serious weekly pin curl habit might use between 30 and 50 bobby pins per set, and the pins had a tendency to disappear at a rate that defied simple explanation. They fell behind vanity tables, worked their way into sofa cushions, vanished from bathroom shelves overnight, so that a constant restocking program was necessary. Bobby pins were sold in large boxes at the 5 and 10 cent store, where they cost very little per unit but sold in such quantities to such a consistent customer base that they constituted a significant revenue category. A woman who appeared in public with a bobby pin still visible in her hair, left there by accident or inattention, was considered to have committed a modest but legible act of negligence, the equivalent of leaving the price tag on a new dress or forgetting to remove the tacking stitches from a jacket lapel. In the autumn semester of 1957, a young woman could enroll in a 12-week charm course at the Patricia Stevens Career College in Chicago for a tuition of approximately $65, a sum representing roughly 2 weeks of average clerical wages, and an investment that the school's enrollment counselors argued would return its cost many times over through the professional and social advantages that a polished, composed personal presentation could unlock. Similar programs operated under slightly different names in every medium and large American city. The Barbizon School in New York and its franchise outlets across the country, the John Robert Powers modeling and charm curriculum that had trained some of the most recognizable faces in American advertising since the 1930s, the local programs run by individual department stores in conjunction with cosmetics companies, who saw the charm school infrastructure as a direct pipeline to trained, enthusiastic cosmetics consumers who understood why each product existed and how it fit into the larger system of composed personal presentation. The charm school was, at its core, a finishing house for the post-war era, a mechanism for translating ambition, social anxiety, and aspirational energy into a marketable, legible, personal presentation that could open doors that raw talent and intelligence alone might not. The posture work came first, because posture was understood as the physical foundation on which all other elements of personal presentation rested. A woman with poor posture could apply her makeup with consummate skill, press her clothes to perfection, and select exactly the right accessories for the occasion, and the sum of all this effort would be undermined and partly erased by the way she carried herself when she entered a room. The book on the head exercise was real and universal. Every charm school used it, and the image of a line of young women walking a carpeted corridor with volumes balanced on their crowns has become the period's defining visual shorthand for the earnestness of the charm school project. But what the image tends to obscure is how effective the exercise actually was as a kinesthetic teaching tool. After enough repetitions, the physical sensation of balanced weight on the crown of the head became the internal reference point for correct posture that no verbal instruction could quite provide. The body learned through the repeated sensory experience what it could not learn through description, and the women who completed charm school courses often reported that the posture correction was the element whose effects they most durably retained into later life. The walking lessons accompanied the posture work. The charm school walk was specific and technical, feet placed on a mental straight line rather than thrown outward in the natural gait of an untrained woman, the centre of gravity slightly forward so that the weight of the body moved smoothly from heel to toe with each step, the hips neither swaying excessively nor clamped artificially still, the arms moving in a small contained arc at the sides rather than the larger, more casual swing of relaxed locomotion. The heel-to-toe weight transfer created the smooth, gliding quality that the era associated with feminine refinement, and it had the secondary effect of slightly lengthening the stride in a way that made a woman appear taller and more authoritative than her natural height might suggest. Fashion photographers of the period, who spent considerable time in the company of professional models and charm school graduates, noted that this trained walk made garments behave differently. The skirt swung more evenly, the jacket lapels lay flatter, the overall composition of the dressed figure appeared more settled and more intentional. Voice modulation occupied a significant portion of the Patricia Stevens curriculum and its equivalents elsewhere. The post-war American voice, nasal in its vowels, strongly regional in its consonants, often fast and somewhat clipped in its overall pacing, was considered problematic in formal social and business contexts, and charm schools devoted considerable time to teaching a slightly lowered, more rounded, more deliberately paced vocal delivery that would read as confident and authoritative without crossing into the territory of aggressive or pushy, which was the vocal equivalent of the Monroe Cosmetic approach. Too loud, too much, too far from the harmonized ideal. Women practiced this in front of mirrors, listening to the way their voices rose at the end of declarative statements, a habit that signaled uncertainty and was to be eliminated through conscious discipline. They practiced filling a sentence with breath rather than rushing through it, and they practiced the specific art of the pause, the brief, considered silence before responding to a question that signaled thoughtfulness and composure, rather than merely a shortage of something to say. The conversational curriculum was perhaps the most sophisticated element of the charm school program, and it was also the most specifically calibrated to the matching imperative. Women were taught that different social contexts demanded different conversational registers. The family dinner table permitted a casual warmth and playfulness that a business luncheon absolutely did not. A cocktail party called for a light, agile wit that could move quickly between topics without ever landing heavily on anything substantive. A formal dinner required the ability to sustain a focused, intelligent conversation with the person on either side across multiple courses. A performance that required genuine listening, careful question construction, and the social discipline to keep the exchange genuinely bilateral rather than inadvertently monological. The woman who delivered the same conversational performance in all these contexts was as out of register as the woman who wore the same face regardless of the occasion, technically present but compositionally wrong. The matching imperative here was explicit and was taught as such. Women were instructed to assess the social register of each occasion before entering it, to identify the appropriate conversational temperature, and to calibrate their participation accordingly. A woman who deployed her cocktail party lightness at a serious business dinner was as conspicuously mismatched as a woman who wore a strapless evening gown to a morning coffee. The social fabric of 1957 operated on a system of contextual registers that were clearly defined, widely understood, and closely monitored by everyone present, and the charm school's function was to make those registers explicit, nameable, and teachable, rather than leaving their acquisition to the accident of fortunate upbringing or the natural intuition that some women possessed and others did not. Seated posture received its own dedicated module in most charm school curricula. The correct way to sit, spine straight but not rigid, ankles crossed and angled to one side rather than crossed at the knee, which was considered ungainly in a skirt, hands resting lightly in the lap rather than grasping the knees or clutching the seat edge, was drilled through repetition until it became habitual. Rising from a seated position was similarly choreographed. The weight moved forward first, then the spine extended upward, then the entire figure came to standing in a smooth, unhurried motion that did not require visible effort or produce the lurching imbalance that an untrained rise from a low sofa invariably created. These were small performances, nearly invisible in any individual execution, but their cumulative effect over the course of an evening, the consistent, composed quality of a woman's physical presence in every transition from sitting to standing to walking, was precisely the kind of thing that was noticed and registered by the practiced social eye, even by people who could not have articulated what they were noticing. What the modern world inherited from the charm school tradition is both more and less than its critics tend to acknowledge. The book on the head is gone, and good riddance to the specific anxieties about regional vowel sounds and the precise placement of a bread plate, and the rigid hierarchical social codes that the charm school helped to reinforce, along with its more genuinely useful instruction. But the fundamental insight, that personal presentation is a composed performance, that manner and appearance exist in a relationship that requires conscious coordination, and that social fluency is a learnable skill rather than an inborn gift of the fortunate, this has not disappeared. It has migrated into self-help books and professional coaching and corporate communication seminars and TED Talks about executive presence, and the women sitting in those modern contexts are engaging in precisely the same project as the young women of 1957 who walked Patricia Stevens' carpeted corridor with their books balanced on their crowns, learning to match themselves to the rooms they would soon be asked to enter. The table manners curriculum at the Patricia Stevens School and its equivalents covered territory that modern readers, if they encounter it at all, tend to find either amusing or oppressive, but that rewards a more careful examination than either response provides. The formal dinner service, with its multiple courses and its specific requirements about which utensil to use for which course, and in which direction to pass the bread basket and how to signal completion to the table service without verbal statement, was a genuinely complex social performance, and the women who had been trained in its navigation and the women who had not were immediately distinguishable to anyone who had spent time in settings where formal service was the norm. The distinction was not trivial in its social consequences. A woman who reached for the wrong fork or who committed the small but legible violation of buttering her entire bread roll at once, rather than breaking off individual pieces to butter individually, marked herself as someone who had not been trained, and in the specific social world of 1957's upper-middle-class entertaining, this marking had consequences that she might not easily undo through any subsequent demonstration of intelligence or charm. The telephone etiquette curriculum addressed a problem that was genuinely novel to the 1950s. The telephone had been sufficiently democratized by the post-war period that it was now the primary medium of social and professional communication for a large proportion of American households, and yet the conventions governing its use had not been fully developed or universally adopted. Charm schools filled this gap with specific actionable guidance. Answer on the second ring rather than the first, which was considered too eager, or the fourth, which suggested insufficient attentiveness. Identify yourself immediately upon answering rather than saying hello and waiting for the caller to identify themselves. Keep social calls brief and purposeful rather than allowing them to extend into the open-ended, time-consuming conversations that the telephone's privacy and convenience made possible. Never telephone during meal times, which remained inviolably reserved for family rather than social traffic, and never before 9 in the morning or after 9 in the evening, which were considered the outer boundaries of acceptable social calling hours. The written communication curriculum covered thank you notes, social invitations, and formal correspondence with a specificity that seems excessive until one understands that written social communication in 1957 was both more frequent and more consequential in its social effects than it is today. A thank you note for a dinner invitation was not optional. It was expected within 48 hours of the occasion, written on personal notepaper rather than a commercial card, in a hand that was legible and, even if not calligraphic, in language that was specific enough to demonstrate genuine attention, noting a particular dish or a particular conversation, or a particular kindness that had been shown during the evening, rather than generic to the point of apparent insincerity. Women who failed to write these notes were noticed, and the failure was registered against them in the social accounts that every hostess maintained, consciously or not, about the obligations and reciprocities of the entertaining circuit. The matched manner extended to paper. The same deliberateness that composed the face composed the note. The role-play exercises that concluded the conversational curriculum at most charm schools of the 1950s were perhaps the most directly practical element of the entire program, because they placed the theoretical knowledge developed over weeks of instruction into a simulated social context where its application could be tested and corrected. Students would be paired or grouped and given specific social scenarios: a business introduction, a formal dinner where one guest was unexpectedly controversial, a cocktail party at which one was the only person who knew no one else, and asked to navigate them in real time while an instructor observed and took notes for the debriefing that followed. The debriefing was calibrated to be corrective without being deflating, pointing out the specific moments where the application of the learned technique had been incomplete or misjudged, and offering specific alternative approaches without suggesting that the overall performance was beyond remediation. A woman's handbag in 1957 was a social document as much as a utilitarian object, and the most important item it contained, more important, arguably, than the wallet, more personal than the handkerchief, more socially charged than any other small object a woman carried on her person, was her compact. The compact was the face's travelling home, the portable version of the vanity table reduced to something that could fit in the palm of a hand and be produced at the powder room mirror or, in the right company and with the right discretion, at the dinner table itself. The ritual of opening a compact in public was governed by a detailed and surprisingly variable set of social rules that depended on the quality of the compact itself, the social register of the setting, and the specific operation being performed. These rules were not written down in any single authoritative source. They were transmitted through observation and imitation, through the casual education that occurred whenever a younger woman watched an older, more socially established woman navigate a social occasion with the ease of long practice. The compact's history as a portable beauty instrument extended back centuries, but its mid-century apotheosis, the extraordinary range and quality and variety of the compacts available to American women in the 1950s, was a direct consequence of the post-war prosperity that had made discretionary spending on decorative objects not merely affordable, but culturally expected of the middle-class household. The compact was simultaneously a cosmetic tool, a decorative object, a status signal, and a small autobiographical document. The woman whose compact you held in your hand for a moment, while she searched for something in her bag, knew something had been communicated about her taste, her means, and her aesthetic sensibility, even before she opened it and applied its contents. Stratton compacts, manufactured in Birmingham, England, from the 1940s onward, occupied the upper reaches of the accessible luxury compact market in 1957. The Stratton was distinguished by its engineering as much as its aesthetics. The brand's signature push-piece mechanism, a small projecting button on the side of the case that released the lid with a satisfying positive click, became one of the small sensory pleasures that women of the period recall with a specificity that suggests genuine emotional attachment. The cases came in a range of finishes: plain polished gold tone, engine-turned patterns in fine crosshatch and barleycorn textures, enamelled designs in floral and geometric motifs, and occasional collaborations with textile manufacturers that produced cases covered in petite point needlework or scarce printed silk. The engine-turned patterns were executed by a mechanical process that cut the regular geometric design into the metal surface with a consistency and precision that handwork could not achieve, and they caught the light in a way that produced a shimmering, slightly iridescent effect, particularly visible when the compact was produced and opened under artificial illumination, the cocktail party light, the restaurant light, the theatre lobby light that were precisely the conditions under which a compact was most often and most deliberately displayed. The choice of compact finish was made in conscious relationship to the rest of one's accessories. A woman who favoured the cool, architectural, clean-line aesthetic associated with the Grace Kelly mode of dressing would select an engine-turned or plain-polished case, its regular geometric surface harmonising with the clean lines of her jewellery and the structured tailoring of her clothes. A woman in the warmer, more ornate decorative tradition might choose an enamelled floral design whose colours complemented the embroidery on her blouse or the printed silk of her scarf. This matching of compact to accessory to outfit was not merely a matter of personal preference. It was understood as an element of compositional coherence, and the woman who carried a compact whose aesthetic register was conspicuously at odds with the rest of her appearance. A baroque, heavily ornamented case with a severely modern ensemble, for instance, was considered to have made a composition error of the same order as a tone mismatch in her lipstick. Volupté compacts, manufactured in Elizabeth, New Jersey, occupied a slightly lower price point but offered an even wider range of novelty designs that made them enormously popular as gifts, for birthdays, for Christmas, for the graduations and engagements that punctuated the social calendar of 1957, with their steady requirement for offerings that were personal enough to feel thoughtful but practical enough to be used. The Volupté line included compacts shaped like clutch bags, compacts with goldfish and crystal-lidded reservoirs, compacts styled as musical instruments and sports equipment, a golf bag, a tennis racket, a tiny piano with working hinges on the lid, and the famous ladies' hand compact, styled to resemble a woman's gloved hand holding a small purse, that sold in vast quantities throughout the 1950s and has since become one of the most recognisable and avidly collected compact designs of the century. These novelty pieces were chosen not for their tonal relationship to a particular outfit, but for their conversational value. The compact that could be produced from a handbag and make the table laugh or exclaim in delight was performing a social function quite distinct from the matched accessory role of the Stratton, and women who owned both understood the difference and made their selection on the basis of the occasion's register. The powder inside the compact was its own subject. Loose powder, applied with a puff, had been the standard face powder format through the first half of the 20th century, but by the mid-1950s, pressed powder in the compact was making significant inroads among women who found the loose powder format too difficult to use conveniently in public settings without risk of mess. The pressed powder offered a compromise. It was contained, controllable and portable, but it sacrificed some of the coverage and the translucent quality of the finest loose powders. Coty's pressed powder in the distinctive blue and gold compact with the powder puff graphic on the lid was the mass market's dominant choice. For women who wanted something that associated them with the luxury end of the cosmetics market, the Elizabeth Arden or Helena Rubinstein pressed powder compacts in their more elaborate cases served the same functional purpose with considerably more semiotic weight. The nose powdering ritual deserves its own careful examination, because it was the occasion on which the compact made its social appearance, and the manner of its execution carried social information as dense as any other element of the matched presentation. A woman who produced a good compact and touched her nose with the powder puff in a single, discreet gesture closed the compact with its satisfying click, and replaced it in her bag before anyone had fully registered the operation had performed the task correctly. She had attended to her appearance without drawing attention to the process of attending to it, which was the foundational principle of the 1957 beauty aesthetic in its public dimension. A woman who held the compact open too long, examined herself too searchingly in the mirror, applied the powder too heavily, or, gravest of all failures, reapplied her lipstick at the dinner table without first excusing herself to the powder room, had committed a violation of the compact etiquette that no quality of the compact itself could compensate for. The object and the performance were inseparable. Both had to be correct simultaneously. The compact collector market of today, a vigorous internationally networked community of women who seek out the Strattons and Voluptés and Elgin Americans of the 1950s at estate sales and antique markets and on auction platforms, is not simply collecting objects. They are collecting the material evidence of a particular philosophy of self-presentation, one that believed in the beauty of useful things and the rightness of matching every element of one's visible surface to every other element with deliberate care. When a collector opens a 65-year-old Stratton compact and the push-piece click is still clean and positive, and the mirror inside is still clear, and the powder puff still holds its original satin quality, she's experiencing the tactile residue of someone else's intentional life. The compact that was chosen for exactly the right reasons, carried on exactly the right occasions, and maintained with exactly the care that the 900 women of 1957 understood their things deserved. The compact's relationship to the lipstick case that accompanied it in the well-appointed handbag of 1957 created an accessory dyad that was the smallest possible version of the matched face philosophy. Two objects chosen in deliberate relationship to each other and to the rest of the bag's contents, creating a micro-composition that was visible for only moments at a time, but was nevertheless assembled with full intentionality. Volupté manufactured matching lipstick cases for many of their compact designs, and collecting the complete set, compact lipstick case, and often a perfume atomizer in the same design, was a particular pleasure of the period's accessory culture. A woman who assembled the complete Volupté ladies' hand set, with its compact and its matching lipstick holder, both styled as diminutive gloved hands, had created a small, perfect world of decorative coherence that reflected the same compositional satisfaction as a perfectly matched table setting or a perfectly coordinated outfit. The cigarette case occupied an interesting adjacent position in this accessory ecology for the significant proportion of 1957 women who smoked. Smoking rates among American women had climbed substantially through the 1940s and continued high through the 1950s, sustained partly by advertising that had long associated smoking with feminine sophistication, and partly by the social function of the cigarette break as a legitimate pause in the social performance, a moment of sanctioned inattention and physical occupation that provided relief from the sustained alertness that polished social conduct demanded. The cigarette case, slim, elegant, often matched in metal and finished to the compact, was an accessory in exactly the same sense as the compact, an object chosen for its appearance as much as its function, and the woman who produced a lovely cigarette case was performing the same kind of accessory refinement as the woman who produced a lovely compact. The difference being that the cigarette case opened a slightly different kind of social conversation than the compact did, one that involved the choreography of the offered cigarette and the accepted light that had its own precise etiquette. The perfume bottle that lived in many women's vanity cases, a small glass or crystal atomizer holding a personal stock of whatever fragrance the woman considered her signature scent, was the olfactory component of the matched presentation, and it operated in a register that none of the other matched elements could access. Fragrance in 1957 was understood to be an extension of personality rather than a cosmetic product in the conventional sense, and the choice of one's signature scent was considered a deeply personal declaration, perhaps the most personal of all the beauty decisions a woman made because it announced her presence before she arrived and lingered after she departed in a way that no visual element of her appearance could replicate. Chanel No. 5, which had been the luxury perfume standard since the 1920s, was matched by the 1950s with Lanvin's Arpège and Christian Dior's Miss Dior as the aspirational fragrances for women who identified with the refined, composed aesthetic of the era's formal entertainments. Evening in Paris by Bourjois, the distinctive dark blue bottle of which appeared on vanity tables in every economic stratum, democratized the idea of the signature scent with a light, sweet floral that was neither as complex nor as expensive as its aspirational competitors, but that served precisely the same psychological function of establishing a personal olfactory signature that composed the wearer's presence into something memorably, distinctively hers. The Elgin American Compact, also American-made and representing the accessible luxury tier of the compact market, offered the reassurance of domestic manufacture to women who associated American craftsmanship with reliability and who preferred to support domestic industry with their discretionary purchases. Their advertisements ran in the same magazines as the English imports, featuring the same compositional language of female elegance and tasteful accessorizing, but the price points were slightly lower and the design vocabulary slightly more conservative, less adventurously ornamental than the volupty novelty line, more accessibly mainstream than the Stratton's English luxury positioning. The Elgin American Compact was the Betty Draper choice rather than the Grace Kelly choice, which is to say, it was the correct choice for considerably more American women than the alternatives. By 6 o'clock on a Friday evening in the autumn of 1957, a suburban housewife in Shaker Heights or Pasadena or Wilmington, who was hosting a dinner party for 8, had been working since approximately 2 in the afternoon, and the kitchen told the story of the preceding 4 hours with magnificent clarity. There were deviled eggs in the refrigerator, arranged on the serving plate her mother had given her at her wedding, each half piped with a smooth yellow filling, made from the yolks mixed with Duke's mayonnaise, and a measured pinch of dry mustard and white pepper, and a touch of cider vinegar for acidity, and touched with a precise sprinkle of Hungarian paprika from the tin she kept on the second shelf of the spice rack. There was a cheese ball on the counter, coated in chopped walnuts, and decorated with a ring of pimiento-stuffed olives, resting on a leaf of butter lettuce that she had selected from the head, with the attention usually reserved for selecting upholstery samples. The bar cart in the living room had been arranged according to a system she'd developed over the preceding years of entertaining, with the liquor bottles standing at the back in descending height order, the cocktail glasses arranged by type in the front left section, the mixing tools arrayed precisely between them. This organisation was not compulsive in any pathological sense. It was a form of social engineering, an attempt to manage the flow of a room full of people by structuring the physical environment so that the evening's movements suggested themselves naturally. The bar cart was placed in the corner opposite the front door, so that guests entering would be drawn across the room rather than clustering near the entrance in the awkward, transitional way that blocked subsequent arrivals and created a bottleneck of social obligation at exactly the moment when the hostess needed to be greeting rather than navigating. The seating was arranged in 2 distinct conversation groupings, a sofa and 2 armchairs flanking the low table on one side, 2 occasional chairs placed at a specific angle on the other, with enough distance between them to allow a skilled hostess to navigate the transition between groups without disrupting either, and with enough proximity that the room's general conversation could still function as a unified social event rather than 2 separate, isolated exchanges. The flowers on the dining table had been arranged that afternoon, their stems cut at the correct diagonal angle, 45 degrees, not straight across, which restricted water uptake and shortened the arrangement's useful life, and their water changed from the morning's arrangement to ensure maximum freshness at serving time. The choice of flowers was not accidental. Our hostess in Shaker Heights had planned her dinner party table with the same compositional deliberateness she brought to planning her face on a formal occasion. The tablecloth was ivory damask, the good tablecloth, not the everyday, which lived in the bottom drawer of the linen press, and was produced only for occasions that genuinely warranted its use. The napkins were a deep teal linen, pressed into the standing bishop's hat fold that required 2 extra ironing minutes per napkin, but produced a table surface of convincingly professional appearance. The flowers were a tight, low arrangement of yellow chrysanthemums and white freesia that brought both the ivory and the teal into the table composition without competing with either. A triangulation of colour that required the same kind of tonal thinking as the matched face, but extended it to fill an entire room. Amy Vanderbilt's Complete Book of Etiquette, published in 1952 and a permanent resident of nearly every middle-class bookshelf for the following 2 decades, included detailed guidance on table setting, floral arrangement, the sequence of courses, the management of service, and the navigational etiquette of the dinner table conversation in language that was authoritative without being intimidating. Its real message being that good entertaining was a learnable skill, available to any woman willing to study and practice it, rather than an innate gift exclusive to women of inherited wealth and social position. This was the etiquette book as democratic document, a guide that assumed its reader was intelligent and capable and needed information, not condescension, and that trust in the reader's intelligence was precisely why the book sold in the quantities it did. Women who consulted it were not performing someone else's ritual. They were acquiring a system that would allow them to perform their own. The cocktail itself was a matched object in this schema, chosen in explicit relationship to the occasion, and the company with the same conscious deliberateness that governed every other element of the composed evening. The old-fashioned was considered appropriate for a masculine company of businessmen and their wives. It was straightforward, slightly austere, with the visual and gustatory authority of bourbon and bitters, and the faint sweetness of the sugar cube that the host would muddle into the glass with a practiced proprietary motion that communicated both technical competence and casual confidence. The daiquiri was summer, was youth, was the seersucker afternoon. Too light and too sweet for a formal November evening, as ill-suited to the occasion as a white linen blazer worn to a winter dinner. The gin martini occupied the apex of cocktail formalism, its requirements absolute, and its execution observed with the critical attention of a jury. Cold glass maintained in the freezer for at least 20 minutes before service. Clean gin, preferably from a bottle the host could name and defend. The merest breath of dry vermouth, administered either by washing the glass and discarding the excess or by applying it in a fine spray from an atomizer that allowed precise control of the ratio. The food itself participated in the matching system in a way that was understood at the time but has been somewhat obscured by the subsequent decades of culinary fashion that have made 1957 dinner party food seem naive or kitschy when viewed from the outside. The gelatin mould, that ubiquitous quivering artifact of mid-century American entertaining that has become a symbol of the era's alleged culinary unsophistication, was not naive. It was a considered response to specific practical requirements. It could be prepared entirely in advance. It released from the mould reliably when the instructions were followed. It travelled well from kitchen to table, without requiring any last-minute attention that would have pulled the hostess away from her guests during the critical first hour of the party, and it looked dramatic on the table in a way that few other cold dishes could match. The hostess, who produced a perfect lime gelatin and cream cheese ring surrounded by fresh parsley, had demonstrated competence in temperature management, in timing, and in visual presentation. 3 of the same skills that the matched face required, applied to a different but structurally analogous domain. The matching imperative at the cocktail hour extended even to the conversation itself. A skilled hostess in 1957 understood that the topic she introduced in the first 20 minutes of the evening established the register for the entire subsequent gathering, and she managed this as deliberately as she managed the bar cart and the seating arrangement. The hostess's job was to keep the conversational temperature warm without letting it run hot, to ensure that every guest felt attended to and included without allowing any single person to dominate the room's attention in a way that left others feeling invisible. She was the conductor of a social orchestra, and the performance she was seeking was the same harmonized ensemble that the matched face sought in its own domain. Every element contributing to a whole that was greater than any individual part, no single voice so loud that it drowned out the others, the overall composition producing in every participant the satisfied sense of having been part of something that was genuinely well done. The sequence in which food was served at a 1957 dinner party was not arbitrary, and the hostess who understood this was using the dinner table as a matched composition in time as well as space. The cocktail hour, those 45 minutes to an hour of standing drinks and hors d'oeuvres, served the structural function of warming the room's social temperature before the more formal and more sustained intimacy of the dinner table itself. A good hostess calibrated the cocktail hour so that it provided enough time for the conversational ice to be broken and the first social groupings to form, but not so much time that the guests became either drunk or simply bored of standing and began to fragment into impatient individuals rather than a coherent social group. The moment to move the party to the table was a judgment call that the skilled hostess made by reading the room's energy, the slight restlessness, the plateau in the conversation's animation, rather than by consulting any fixed schedule. The Jell-O mold's place in this narrative has been systematically misunderstood by subsequent cultural commentary. The mid-century gelatin salad, the aspic ring, the vegetable suspension in lemon or lime gelatin, the cream cheese and olive loaf, has been so thoroughly adopted as a symbol of 1950s naivete that it is nearly impossible to see it for what it was when it was current. A technically sophisticated, practically well-adapted solution to the specific challenges of the casual dinner party as it was practiced in the American suburbs during a decade when domestic labour was performed without commercial kitchen equipment, without professional kitchen training, and without the leisure to devote the day before a dinner party to the preparation of dishes that required last-minute attention. The gelatin mould was nearly indestructible once set, unmouldable with confidence by an experienced hand, visually dramatic on the serving plate, and accompanied by a cultural mythology, reinforced by the Knox and Jell-O advertising of the period that associated it with modernity, with science applied to domestic life, with the confident post-war housewife who welcomed new materials and new methods. The woman who served a beautiful lime and cream cheese ring on a bed of iceberg lettuce was not naive. She was practical, organised, and working within a sophisticated understanding of what her dinner party needed to succeed. The ice cream bomb, the perfect centrepiece of the mid-century formal dinner dessert, required genuine technical skill. A sphere of ice cream, often 2 or 3 flavours arranged in concentric layers, frozen in a rounded mould, unmoulded at the table in a theatrical gesture that required timing, confidence, and the right temperature of the mould and the ice cream within it. The woman who could unmould a perfect bomb at the dinner table, whose ice cream sphere came away clean and maintained its shape through the brief transit from kitchen to table, had demonstrated a competence in temperature management and theatrical timing that her guests recognised as skilled performance, and the slight intake of breath around the table as the mould came away clean was the dining table equivalent of the appreciative murmur that greeted any well-executed technical feat. This was entertaining as performance art, and the hostess who mastered it was the star of her own production, the director and the lead actor simultaneously, maintaining the appearance of effortlessness while executing a sequence of technical operations that required everything she had. The kitchen organisation that preceded the dinner party and made its smooth execution possible was itself a kind of matching operation. The mise en place of the domestic hostess, the advanced preparation that organised every element of the evening's production into the correct position before the performance began. A woman who had not thought through the sequence of her preparations, who found herself serving the cheese ball before the devilled eggs were plated, or discovered the champagne was warm when the first course was clearing, had failed at the organisational equivalent of the matched face. She had allowed the individual elements to emerge in an order that did not serve the whole, and no quality of the individual elements could compensate for the incoherence of their sequence. A woman dressing for a formal occasion in 1957 began not with what anyone would see, but with what no one would see. And this invisible infrastructure was as carefully constructed as the visible surface that would be judged and read by everyone in the room. The foundation garment came first. A long-line girdle or a waist cincher, depending on the silhouette the dress required, followed in many cases by a boned long-line brassiere that extended to the natural waist and provided the smooth, continuous line from shoulder to hip that the era's fitted silhouettes demanded. Over these went a full-length slip in silk or fine nylon. The slip was not merely a layer of modesty but a protective garment that prevented the outer dress from clinging to the stockings in the phenomenon of static electricity that plagued synthetic fabrics in the dry-heated interiors of winter homes. Then came the petticoat, if the skirt required it, the nylon net understructure that gave the full-skirted evening dress its bell-shaped volume. Then the dress itself, then the jewellery, chosen in deliberate relationship to the dress's neckline, the earrings scaled to be visible beneath or above whatever the hairstyle would obscure, then the gloves, then the shoes, then the bag. Each layer depended for its correct function on the correct placement of the layers beneath it, and removing any element from the sequence produced a visible degradation of the final result that an experienced eye could identify immediately. The girdle of 1957 was a remarkable garment, an engineering achievement in stretch nylon and powernet elastane that had benefited significantly from post-war synthetic fabric development. Worn as Legant, Maidenform's Conchetta, Formfit's Style Crest and Playtex's Living Girdle all competed for the loyalty of a market that spent well over $200 million annually on foundation garments through the middle 1950s. The marketing language was extraordinary in its combination of technical authority and aspirational poetry. These advertisements did not merely promise a slimmer figure, they promised a controlled figure, a smooth figure, a figure in command of itself, a figure that declared its wearer's relationship to discipline and self-management as clearly as any element of her visible surface. The word control ran through the foundation garment copy like a structural thread, appearing in the names of individual products and in the descriptive language of their advertisements with a regularity that was neither accidental nor purely semantic. It was a promise about a certain relationship to the body and to the social world the body moved through. The construction of a quality girdle of the 1957 period was genuinely complex. The garment had to perform simultaneous and somewhat contradictory functions. It had to compress and smooth the abdomen and hip without creating the ridgelines or the pressure marks that would show through the outer skirt. It had to be firm enough to maintain the smoothing effect through hours of standing, sitting, dancing, and moving in and out of car seats without losing its structural integrity. It had to be comfortable enough to wear for an entire evening without producing the kind of physical discomfort that would be visible on the wearer's face, since a woman who could be seen to be suffering from her undergarments had failed at one of the fundamental requirements of formal dress. And it had to be constructed in a way that allowed the natural functions of the body to continue while none of this showed. Playtex's Living Girdle was named for its attempt to address the last of these requirements by using a more flexible elastane formulation than its competitors, and the name was an argument, a claim that the right foundation garment would feel like a second skin rather than a mechanical device. The crinoline petticoat operated through a different principle entirely than the girdle, where the girdle controlled by compression, the crinoline amplified by volume, creating a circumference of stiffened nylon net beneath the skirt that held the fabric away from the legs in a perfect unwavering bell. A good crinoline had a specific density of net layers. Too few and the skirt collapsed between dances or settled limply against the legs when the wearer stood still, destroying the silhouette that the evening dress had been designed to produce. Too many, and it became unwieldy, catching on furniture and brushing against other guests in the close quarters of a crowded ballroom, creating an unpleasantly mechanical quality of movement that reminded observers of stage costumes rather than evening dress. The starch that maintained the crinoline's body was reapplied with each washing, and the careful calibration of starch concentration was itself a skill. Too little, and the net went soft. Too much, and it scratched against the legs and made a crackling noise with each step that was discernible to nearby conversation partners. The gloves were not optional. This point deserves its full emphasis because the glove rule of 1957 has been so thoroughly eroded by subsequent decades of casual dress that its former absolute authority is difficult to fully appreciate without some effort of historical imagination. Day gloves, short, white or pastel or black, often in cotton piqué or lightweight nylon, were expected at luncheons, at shopping in goods stores, at any formal daytime occasion that took place in an indoor public setting where one would be meeting people above the level of close personal acquaintance. Evening gloves were long, typically reaching to the elbow or above, in white or ivory kid or fine stretch satin, and their presence at a formal evening event was as much a social requirement as wearing shoes. The length of the glove was matched with specific deliberateness to the length of the sleeve. A sleeveless evening gown demanded an above-the-elbow glove. A short-sleeved dress required a medium-length glove that met or slightly overlapped the sleeve hem. A long-sleeved dress released the wearer from gloves entirely for the evening. These were not suggestions, they were rules, as definitional to the formal occasion as the white tie requirements for men's evening dress, and the woman who violated them was not merely unfashionable, but specifically legible as someone who had not mastered the system. The stockings that connected the foundation garments to the shoes occupied the most visible portion of the invisible infrastructure, visible in the sense that any gap or imperfection in them was immediately apparent, and could not be concealed without removing oneself from the social setting entirely. Fully fashioned nylon stockings, knit flat and seamed at the back in a straight vertical line, that had to be maintained in a perfect, undeviating position throughout the evening, were considered the correct choice for formal occasions through the mid-1950s, before the seamless stocking began its gradual displacement of the seam style. Keeping the seam straight was an act of proprioception and constant subtle attention. A woman in seamed stockings checked her seams in every mirror she passed, made the small rotational adjustments with each check, and was aware throughout the evening of whether the line was holding or whether it had drifted into the soft kneed in direction that was the stocking's version of bad posture. Dyeable satin pumps closed the system at the bottom. Shoes of plain cream satin that could be taken to the shoe dyer at the department store and coloured to match any evening fabric were the mid-century solution to the matching imperative at its most literal and most demanding. A woman purchasing a pale blue chiffon ball gown would bring a swatch of the fabric to the shoe dyer. A craftsman who occupied a small specialised corner of the department store's shoe department, who would mix the dye to match it with remarkable fidelity, and spray the satin pumps in a single even coat that dried to a flat, slightly matte finish. These shoes were worn once or twice before the dye wore unevenly from the toe and heel, at which point they might be redyed in a darker colour and thus extended into a second life before final retirement. This system produced a matching that approached identity, the dress and the shoe occupying essentially the same position on the colour wheel, and it was the furthest, most logically committed extension of the matching imperative, the point at which the composed woman and the composed moment became, for an evening, indistinguishable from each other. The formal evening glove created a specific technical challenge at the dinner table that every woman who wore one had to navigate without drawing attention to the navigation. The correct etiquette for the formal glove at dinner required the wearer to remove the glove before eating, specifically, to tuck it inside the opera-length glove by rolling it down from the wrist, rather than pulling the glove entirely off the hand, which would have required the use of both hands and created the awkward question of where to put a long satin glove during a three-course dinner. The tucked-down glove allowed the hand to eat freely, while the remainder of the glove stayed in place at the wrist, ready to be unrolled at the end of dinner when the gloves would be replaced for dancing or for the move to the drawing room. This technical requirement demanded advanced practice, because a woman who had not rehearsed the motion and attempted it for the first time under social observation invariably created a fumbling, conspicuous performance that drew exactly the kind of attention the manoeuvre was designed to avoid. The hat that completed the formal daytime ensemble in 1957 was itself a matched element whose selection required understanding of its relationship not only to the outfit beneath it, but to the hairstyle visible around and beneath it. The pillbox hat, which would become most closely associated with the early 1960s through the influence of a specific First Lady, was already well established in the mid-decade millinery vocabulary, and its particular demands on the hairstyle beneath it were exacting. The pillbox sat on the very crown of the head, not tilted, not angled, but absolutely level, positioned to show the face fully and to allow the hair below it to provide the visual transition between the hat's geometric simplicity and the face beneath. This positioning required a hairstyle that was close and smooth at the crown, and either swept up at the sides or softly curved at the temples, providing enough visual interest at the periphery to complement the hat's formal austerity without competing with its clean lines. The accessory coordination that completed the formal daytime look in 1957 operated through a system of matching that was governed by material as much as colour. The rule that handbag and shoes should match was well established by the mid-decade and widely followed, not merely in colour, which was the easily observed element, but in material quality, which was the element that a trained eye would read as the true indicator of the ensemble's coherence. A woman who wore fine leather shoes with a fabric handbag had created an internal inconsistency that was not always immediately legible to the casual observer, but was always immediately legible to the experienced one. The materials should be in conversation with each other, the same register of quality and the same general material family, and the colours should then coordinate within that register. The entire surface of the 1957 woman's formal daytime appearance, from the crown of her hat to the heel of her shoe, participated in this coordinated system, and the knowledge required to maintain the coordination across all these simultaneous variables was genuine knowledge, practically acquired through experience and socially reinforced through observation and correction. The post-war synthetic fabric revolution that filled 1957 department store racks with nylon and dacron and orlon and arnel and a dozen other trademarked fibre combinations created new challenges for the wardrobe layering system that wool and silk and cotton had not posed. Synthetic fabrics were often static-prone in ways that natural fibres were not, which meant that the slip between the girdle and the outer dress, always functionally important as a friction-reducing layer, became structurally essential when both the outer layer and the foundation garment were synthetic, because without the silk or nylon slip between them, the dress and the girdle would cling together in a way that made movement awkward and created a silhouette quite different from the one the dress had been designed to produce. Women who had not yet fully absorbed this implication of the synthetic fabric revolution found it out through experience at occasions where they could not easily correct it. In the summer of 1941, the War Production Board of the United States government declared lipstick an essential commodity, exempting it from the materials restrictions that were beginning to limit the production of other cosmetic items as the war economy tightened its grip on the allocation of raw materials. This decision was not purely pragmatic, though its defenders offered practical arguments readily enough. The morale of the female workforce mattered in a period when that workforce was being recruited into manufacturing roles that required sustained physical and psychological effort, and the small daily pleasure of a tube of lipstick was considered a negligible cost against the significant benefit of keeping women's spirits high enough to sustain 12-hour shifts. Beneath these practical arguments lay a cultural conviction that ran considerably deeper. That lipstick, and specifically red lipstick, was not a cosmetic luxury, but a form of social armour, a visible declaration of continuity and controlled femininity that served a stabilising function in a society under the enormous pressure of total war. By 1957, this wartime decision had been fully absorbed into the peacetime mythology of the red lip, and its meaning had shifted from survival tool to something subtler and in some ways more demanding. The red lip of 1957 was not the defiant assertion of the wartime worker who applied her victory red before clocking into the munitions plant. It was a deliberate aesthetic statement about a woman's relationship to power, to self-presentation, and to the specific social register she wished to occupy in the ordered, prosperous, and deceptively complex landscape of post-war suburban America. The red lip said something. It had always said something. But what it said in the 1950s was more nuanced, more stratified, and more carefully calculated than the blunt declaration it had made during the war years. Revlon's Cherries in the Snow, introduced in 1953, was the lipstick that crystallized this post-war red lip identity for the mass American market. The formula was a true blue red. The blue pigment in the formulation gave it a slightly cool cast that distinguished it from the orange reds and coral reds that populated the rest of the market. And its packaging was black and gold, a combination of the most authoritative colours in the cosmetics vocabulary of the period. Charles Revson had built his cosmetics empire on a radical commercial insight, that lipstick and nail polish should be sold as coordinated colours, that the face and the hand should match, and that this matching should be updated every season, with the same relentless velocity that the fashion industry applied to hemlines and sleeve treatments. This insight, which seems obvious in retrospect but was genuinely revolutionary in its application, transformed the American cosmetics business from a category of stable, slowly evolving products into a fashion industry with all of fashion's attendant urgency and obsolescence, and it made Revlon the most powerful cosmetics company in America through the 1950s. Fire and Ice, the Revlon campaign of 1952 that preceded Cherries in the Snow and established the emotional register that Cherries would inhabit, had asked American women directly whether they were bold enough to wear a certain shade of red. The advertisement took the form of a quiz, 15 provocative questions about the wearer's personality and appetites, each one designed to suggest that the woman who could answer yes was a specific, desirable, slightly transgressive type of person, and that the woman who answered no was perhaps playing it too safely. This was cosmetic marketing as social psychology, and it worked with a sophistication that still commands respect when examined at this distance. It sold the lipstick by selling the identity it implied, and it made the purchase an act of self-declaration, rather than mere cosmetic acquisition. Women did not buy Fire and Ice because they needed a red lipstick. They bought it because they wanted to be the woman that a particular kind of red lipstick certified them to be. Tangy lipstick occupied a different register in the 1957 red lip landscape. Tangy's famous colour change formula, a pale orange in the tube that reacted with the specific chemistry of individual lips to produce a personalised coral or pink, or rose on the wearer, had been a bestseller since the 1930s, and its continued popularity through the post-war era was based on an appeal to naturalism and personalization that contradicted Revlon's boldness strategy in almost every dimension. Tangy promised a red that was yours alone, generated by your own specific biology rather than applied from outside like theatrical paint. The Tangy lip was not the red that everyone who bought it would wear. It was theoretically different on every woman who applied it, a democratic promise in the same spirit as the beauty magazine's insistence that every woman could be beautiful in her own way, calibrated to her own specific combination of characteristics. This was a reassurance specifically calibrated for women who wanted the social authority of the red lip without what they perceived as its theatrical self-advertisement. The act of applying red lipstick in 1957 was itself a performance with a specific choreography. The lipstick was applied in 2 passes, an outline first, using the corner of the bullet to define the Cupid's bow at the top and the natural curve at the bottom, with a precision that required the steady hand of long practice, then a fill of the remaining area using the flat of the bullet, followed by blotting on a piece of tissue folded once to provide a fresh absorbing surface, followed by a second application over the blotted base to build the colour's depth and longevity. The 2-application technique was the professional standard, taught in beauty schools and charm schools and beauty columns alike, because it produced a lip colour that was more densely pigmented and more resistant to the mechanical removal of eating and drinking than a single thick application could achieve. Some women finished with a light pressing of face powder over the applied colour, which set the lipstick slightly and extended its staying power at the cost of slightly muting the colour's intensity. The colour matching between the red lipstick and the outfit in 1957 followed conventions that were more nuanced than the simple prohibition against clashing that popular memory has assigned to the era. A blue-toned red lip, a blue red, as beauty editors called it, belonged with cool palette clothing: navy, grey, black, royal blue, cool lilac. A warm red, an orange red, shifting toward coral, with its warmth produced by the greater proportion of yellow in the pigment formulation, belonged with the warm palette: camel, rust, gold, cream, olive green, the tobacco browns that were enormously popular in women's daywear through the mid-decade. A true neutral red, balanced precisely between warm and cool, was the most versatile and the most demanding. It worked with anything, but it also announced itself most loudly as a colour choice, without the alibi of tonal relationship to the outfit to partially explain and justify its presence. The woman in the neutral red was making the boldest statement, claiming the lipstick purely for its own authority. The matched face of 1957, seen in its totality, the prepared skin, the calibrated foundation, the precisely drawn liner, the chosen powder, the specific red, was not a mask. It was an argument, made in a language of cosmetics and fabric and accessory and manner that was as specific and as legible to its intended audience as the spoken language they shared. The argument was about competence, about intentionality, about the disciplined and sustained attention to one's own surface that the culture of the period valued as both an aesthetic achievement and a social credential. That this argument required so much of the women making it, the hours of preparation, the financial investment in the right products, the social knowledge to deploy all of it correctly in the right context at the right moments, is the thing we see most clearly from this distance, and must acknowledge most honestly. But seeing the difficulty clearly is different from seeing only the difficulty. The women of 1957 who sat at their zinc vanity tables on a winter morning and matched their lipstick to their dress were also making something, a composed moment, a specific and irreproducible version of themselves. And the making itself had a dignity and a seriousness that the object it produced was too often dismissed for being merely decorative. It was not merely decorative, it was a statement about who they were, made in the only language the world of 1957 was prepared to hear. The red lip was the final word of that statement, and it was meant to be heard. The lipstick's longevity, its staying power through the activities and social obligations of the day, was a technical problem that the cosmetics industry of the 1950s attacked with genuine ingenuity. Hazel Bishop's long-lasting formula had demonstrated that the technical barrier was not insuperable, and by the mid-decade every major cosmetics company was attempting to develop formulas that would extend the wear time of their lip colours beyond the 2 to 3 hour maximum that most conventional pigmented waxes provided. The challenge was that the properties that made lipstick comfortable and attractive on the lips, its emollient, cushioning softness, its high gloss finish, its ability to be applied smoothly without dragging or pulling, were precisely the properties that prevented it from bonding durably to the lip surface. A formula stiff enough to stay on through a meal was too stiff to be comfortable. A formula soft enough to feel luxurious wore off too quickly to be practical. The touch-up ritual was the era's practical solution to this unsolved technical problem, and it was itself a composed performance with its own etiquette requirements. A woman who excused herself from the dinner table, with the minimum of verbal announcement, just a quiet word to the host and a smooth, unhurried rise from her chair, and returned 5 minutes later with freshened lip colour, had performed a maintenance operation that was as much a social grace as a cosmetic necessity. She had attended to her appearance in private, which was where such attention was supposed to occur, and she had returned to the table looking as she was supposed to look, which was as she had looked when the evening began. The deterioration that had occurred between application and touch-up was not her fault. It was the fault of eating and drinking and talking and the passage of time. But the responsibility to correct it was hers, and the correction was to be effected invisibly and without comment. The modern cosmetics industry has arguably solved the longevity problem that bedeviled the 1950s formulators, but the solution has come with its own set of new parameters. Long-wearing lip formulas of the current era achieve their durability through formulations that are often extremely drying. The same chemical properties that prevent the pigment from migrating also prevent the skin from retaining its own moisture, and the trade-off between wear time and comfort has simply been relocated rather than eliminated. The transfer-proof lip of today achieves what Hazel Bishop was attempting in 1951, and in achieving it has also eliminated the touch-up ritual, the brief, gracious social pause, the compact produced, the fresh application, the small resetting of the face's statement. That was itself a performance with meaning and protocol. What has been gained in convenience has been lost in ceremony, and whether the exchange represents progress depends entirely on how one values ceremony itself. The women of 1957, who calibrated their red lipstick to their outfit and their occasion, and their company and their light, and who touched it up with a pocket mirror in the powder room before the dessert course, and who understood that these small acts of maintenance were not vanity but craft. Those women might have found our permanent lip stains convenient, but they would probably have missed the ritual. The ritual was, in some sense, the point. The cultural archaeology of the red lipstick returns us eventually to the simple physical object, the brass or gold-toned tube, the wax cylinder within it in its specific red, the cold metallic touch of the case when it emerged from a purse on a winter afternoon, the small resistance of the mechanism as it was twisted to extend the colour. These objects have survived in extraordinary numbers, collected, preserved, traded among people who understand that the tube and its colour are the most compact possible repository of an enormous amount of social and personal history. To hold a 1957 Revlon Cherries in the Snow lipstick is to hold the specific object through which several million women made a specific statement about themselves in a specific historical moment. The colour has not changed. The argument it was making has not been resolved. The red lip is still red, and it is still, in its way, armour.